Order. Welcome to this afternoon's meeting of the Foreign Affairs Committee, where we're taking evidence on our inquiry into political Islam. I think for the benefit of our witnesses and the people who are taking an interest in this evidence session, let me try and put the inquiry into context. The whole role of wider political Islam is a very important one in the development of the politics of the region over the last 4 or 5 years. There are theses out there that successful development of political Islam will be a bulwark against a move to violent extremism, and equally there are views that political Islam, as it's developed in various parts of the region, are a gateway towards violent extremism. There has been some controversy over the British government's report into the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, and it's the role of this committee to oversee the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in particular, and to for us to come to our view on where the merits of these arguments lie. And I just want to say, in that respect, I'm extremely grateful for the quality of the witnesses who have come to give us evidence today. You will find the questions are intended to be quite sharp and direct. That does not mean that we have come to a view. We are testing propositions, and therefore will invite your replies to quite direct questions about the direction of political Islam and the elements which you're responsible for. We will try and direct the questions to individuals where appropriate, and I invite my colleagues to make matters straightforward for the interpreter for Mr. Munir by crisp, short questions. And if I can say to the interpreter, it is extremely important, whilst I understand that you might have been a person who could have given evidence to us yourself, is that you must do your best to faithfully translate the questions and to faithfully translate Mr. Munir's views and not advance your own interpretation. That's the context. We are going to be interrupted, I believe, for votes at 4 o'clock. I'm uncertain as to how long that break will be. It might be 15 minutes, it might be 45, I don't know. But it would be my objective then to reconvene after that and to try and complete this session by 5:30 this afternoon. So that's the context. And if I can perhaps ask all of you the same question to start with, because in the evidence, the very substantial amount of written evidence this inquiry has already received, there is a deal of discussion about the term political Islam. And some of you have given your own reservations around the use of that term. And I wonder if you have reservations about how the term is used and how it's understood, you could explain to the committee your concerns and your definitions about political Islam. And perhaps I could start with you, Dr. Masmoudi.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. I think political Islam is probably the most misunderstood and vague word used in politics today around the world. It's used to describe various political parties, some that are moderate, some that are extremist, some that are even violent. I think it simply is not a clear term, and it has been dangerously misinterpreted by people who claim to represent Islam or who claim to work on behalf of Islam or to defend Islam. So I would say it's basically it is used to refer to political parties that you have Islam as one of their sources of values, of ideas. But again, it is not too well defined at all, and it is not, and I think it has been abused a lot by many groups. So it's a terminology that is, I think, dangerous.
Okay, well, that noted that caution. And Dr. Mazmoudi, I should introduce you for the benefit of the record. You're an advisor to Mr. Rashid Ghannouchi. That's correct. Yes. The president of ANADA.
ANADA.
Perhaps I can now turn to Mr. Munir. It's correct to describe you as the Deputy Supreme Guide of the Muslim Brotherhood, and you were appointed to that position in 2013 after the removal of the Brotherhood from power in Egypt. Is that correct, and does that properly describe your position?
Yes, sir. Thank you. It's just right.
That's correct. But do you have reservations about how the term political Islam is used?
الحقيقة الإسلام السياسي تعبير جديد. الثقافة الإسلامية والثقافة السياسية الإسلامية إذا جاز التعبير. هذا التعبير يعني أن هناك أجزاء في الإسلام، إسلام سياسي وإسلام غير سياسي. في تصورنا نحن في جماعة الإخوان المسلمين أن الإسلام يشمل الأمور كثيرة، كل ما يمس الإنسان، حياة الإنسان في دنياه وفي آخرته. ولهذا نقول أن الإسلام دين شامل يشمل العمل السياسي، العمل المجتمعي، العمل الإغاثي. هذا لا تفريق بينهم، ومسلم أو أي جماعة إسلامية أو هيئة إسلامية تقوم بهذا المنهج في إطار القوانين والدساتير الموجودة التي تعمل فيها في بلادها.
The word or the term political Islam is new to Islamic culture. Since in Islam we don't know something called political Islam and non-political Islam, because the fact that Islam comprises all aspects of life. It is a very comprehensive religion, and it covers all kinds of activities, whether it is political work, social work, human or humane work, in relief and charity deeds and actions, and therefore we found it an alien terminology from the viewpoint of Islam. Yes, and the last bit he mentioned that the Muslim is required, according to Islam, to be active in all these venues, but abiding with the constitutions and the laws and the legislations which govern the society.
Okay, we'll have some follow-up questions on that issue. Dr. Al-Takriti. You're Chief Executive Officer of the Cordova Foundation.
The Cordova Foundation, correct. Yeah. Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Committee.
And you're Chairman of the Muslim Association of Britain.
I'm Chairman of the Muslim Association of Britain, correct. I think that the problem with the term political Islam is also could be similarly told of how this panel was addressed in the email that was sent to us, that we are senior figures of senior Islamist figures, and that in itself is also problematic. I think that today in today's language we do have several problems in terms of terms which have become coined in themselves and identifiable, but the meaning of which is far from being agreed upon. And I think that from the submissions that you've received and from what you've just told us and from what you're going to hear today, you will find that same variance. And if, from a personal point of view, I always have a problem with terms when I see that the players and actors whom that term is hoisted upon, themselves differ upon what it means, then we have a problem with the term. But in any way, just to come to identify exactly what it is that we hope to be addressing today, I think that we're talking to something which is akin, just to bring something that we all know culturally and historically, in our memories, in the example of Christian Democrats. I think that we're talking about a spectrum of political life today, which involves the religious movements, Islamic movements, which have something to say on a political level. And that spectrum, as I made in my submission, that spectrum is extremely broad. And it starts from the extreme right, where we have those who wish to enforce change by any means available to them on a political level, to those whom wish to engage with political life but abhor violence and reject violence in any way and unconditionally. So we have that broad spectrum, and the problem that emerges is from that very spectrum. Because when we have the likes of, for instance, we have in Britain the Hizb al-Tahrir, who dissuade from any kind of engagement in political systems in Britain or elsewhere. And we also have the likes of Saad Ibrahim Munir, for instance, who is from the Muslim Brotherhood, and that kind of thought, who promote political engagement. So to have those varied viewpoints and standpoints within one particular label is in itself problematic. But it's something that we'll have to contend with, simply because it's become an icon and a reality of life, and that's something which I hope that we can slightly decipher throughout the discussion this afternoon.
Ms. Hassan, if I can put the same question to you, but invite you to introduce yourself first, and thank you very much for coming. It's not often we've had a witness who is under sentence of death. Obviously the fact that you're a witness to our committee may take some view of the merits of the jurisprudence process you've gone through. But perhaps you could introduce yourself for the record, and then if you've got a view on the use of political Islam, please.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. My name is Sundas Asim. I'm from Egypt. I'm currently an independent scholar, but previously I served in the office of President Mohammed Morsi as foreign media coordinator. Concerning the topic at hand and the definition of political Islam, I agree with the previous comments that it should be dealt with very cautiously. And it is not political Islam as a term. It is not something that Islamic parties or parties that have an Islamic reference have chosen for themselves. I think it's mostly an academic term, just like the term Islamists. So I think it's important to be cautious with the characterization and the accuracy of it. Also, it is a spectrum. It's not one thing. Parties that have an Islamic reference are not one and the same. In Egypt, for example, where I came from, after the Arab Spring, we had different parties were collectively characterized as Islamist. For example, there was the Muslim Brotherhood on the one hand, that established the Freedom and Justice Party in the aftermath of the 2011 revolution. There were also the Salafis, who actually had more than one party representing their ideology. And there were parties that were inspired by the Muslim Brotherhood ideology, but who chose to have their own independent existence as other parties, like the Al-Wasat Party, for example, like the Strong Egypt Party. And each of these parties, they advocated different political platforms after the Arab Spring. And I think judging these different political parties should be based on how each party has reacted in the aftermath of the revolution, what were their stances on different policies, their track record in general. I think it's important to distinguish between them and not to conflate all parties together as one thing. And of course, I do not consider violent extremists as one form of political Islam. I think this is a totally independent phenomenon which I think is terrorism. I think terrorism is terrorism. I don't think they even believe in politics as an idea or a practice.
Okay, Yasmin Qureshi.
Thank you. I think there's a perception in the Western world that somehow democracy and Islam are not compatible. And I think it's often done with reference to what's happening in the Middle East, where there's obviously a lot of kingdoms and lack of democratic processes. But then if you look at some of the larger Muslim nations like Bangladesh or Pakistan, Indonesia, Malaysia, they seem to have a tradition of elections and parties and whatever, and yet they would call themselves Islamic State. So can I therefore ask you, how do you define democracy and its relationship with Islam?
Of course, that's a very difficult question, but I'm also the president of the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy, which is based in Washington, D.C., and I've been the president for 17 years. So we've been working on this issue since 1999, even before 9/11. Basically, Muslims are struggling with modernity. What does it mean to be Muslim in the 21st century? And how can we combine Islamic values with the values of modernity, democracy being probably one of the most important values of modernity. So, of course, democracy means tolerance, means accountability of the government. It's not just elections, but also freedoms, freedom of expression, freedom of organization, equality before the law, citizenship, the idea of citizenship. A lot of these values are modern values, they're new values. And so in Islamic jurisprudence, most of Islamic jurisprudence was written 1,000 years ago or in the first 3 centuries of Islam. So you don't find any reference to these terms or to these ideas in Islamic jurisprudence. And so we are struggling in the Islamic world about how do we understand Islam in the 21st century. The overwhelming majority of Muslims believe, of course, that the Quran is the literal word of God. And so we are bound by the Quran. That is what God wants us to do. But how do we understand it in the context of the modern society and modern life? And so this struggle is tough, is difficult, especially when we have dictatorships ruling most of the Arab and Muslim world, when there is no opportunity for even discussing these ideas. And I think this is what has been the problem. The main reason for a rise of violence and extremism and radicalism in the Arab Muslim world is dictatorship, because it hasn't allowed a free expression or free discussion of these ideas, such as what does it mean to be Muslim in the 21st century? How do we understand Islam in the 21st century? This is why democracy is so important. Democracy is the key to enter modernity, to enter a modern life, to be able to interpret Islam. Of course, the interpretation will differ. This is normal. There will be different interpretations, but that's why we need discussions and we need freedoms to listen to various opinions and various ideas, and to emerge from that with a modern interpretation of Islam. So in Tunisia, we believe that our goal in Tunisia is to prove that Islam and democracy are compatible, that we do not have to choose between being Muslim and being a Democrat. And we believe that the two are completely compatible with each other, and that's how we have to modernize, and we have to and it takes time, so we have to be patient with the process. The process is not instantaneous. There's no country that was able to build democracy in 1 year or 2 years. It takes time. But it has to be an inclusive democracy. It has to include everybody, whether they are Muslim or non-Muslim, whether they are pious or non-pious, secular or non-secular. The discussion has to include everybody, and democracy has to be an inclusive democracy. The minute we start to exclude certain groups of people from the democratic process, that is, I think, when we basically give the kiss of death to democracy.
مسألة بالنسبة لنا دين قبل أن تكون سلوك إنساني، مع احترام السلوك الإنساني، بالنسبة للفرد الديمقراطية في تعبيرنا هي أصلها في الشريعة الإسلامية تسمى الشورى، بمعنى أنه لا يمكن أن يتم أمر إلا باختيار الناس وبرأي الناس أو بما يمكن أن يجمع عليه الناس إلا بيكن إجماع كامل على الأقل في الصورة في الأغلبية. الديمقراطية في عندنا أن تبدأ من داخل الفرد نفسه في حرية الاعتقاد، حرية الحركة، حرية التصور في إطار القانون الذي ينظم المجتمع الذي يعيش فيه، إضافة إلى أنه لابد من أي حاكم أو حتى في داخل الجو.
Yes. The matter for us is in the first in the first is the religion before the human behavior and conduct. Though we value very much and we highly place the human conduct. But when we come to the religion of Islam, we'll find two things. One of them, that democracy is deeply rooted in the Sharia, the Islamic law or Islamic legislation, and that is in the principle of Shura. The principle of Shura make it a must that no decision will be taken unless the majority is agreeing on that. So when we move to the level of the individuals, an individual cannot have the individual is enjoying 100% freedom of belief. This is the instructions or the tenets of Islam. And from that starts the major principle of democracy that will be the basis for the other various freedoms and rights.
في اللوائح أو في القوانين التي يجب أن يعتمدها أي عمل سواء إسلامي أو غير إسلامي، لابد أن يعتمد يتصور ابتداء أن الفرد نفسه له كيان، وأن هذا الفرد مهما كانت قيمته في المجتمع صغيرة أو كبيرة، غني أو فقير، هذا الفرد لابد أن يكون له اعتبار داخل إطار المجتمع العام وله رؤية حسب نظام الدولة داخل كيف تدار الدولة، كيف تدار الشركة، كيف تدار الجماعة. بهذه الصورة الفرد عندنا في الأساس هو أساس هذا العمل. هناك تعبير يقول أن الله سبحانه وتعالى خلق الناس أحرارا فلا يمكن أن يكونوا عبيد لأي أحد.
When it comes to the legislations and laws which to be adopted by any Islamic or non-Islamic work, the individual has to be considered, and each individual has his own entity and his own presence and his own status, regardless his position in the society, whether it is a low position or high position, whether rich or poor. And every one of them has to be considered, and each one of them has a role in running the affairs of the state. We have an expression within the literature of Islam that God has created men free, so no one has the right to enslave them.
I would absolutely second what Dr. Masmoudi said in terms of the problematization of being a Muslim in the 21st century. It's an ongoing question, it's an ongoing discussion. And democracy is, and obviously since the Arab Spring, the question of government and the shape of a state, of what political Islam or proponents of political Islam are aiming for and envisaging. All these have become recent additions to what is being discussed. If we were asking this 10, 15, 20 years ago, definitely it would be a big issue and a big subject of debate. I recall myself being involved in heated discussions and actually in one particular incident being questioned as I was departing the country that asked me to come and speak about Islam and democracy because of the way in which I proposed that democracy should be accepted and espoused by proponents of political Islam. The problem is that this particular problem is now much less spoken of, simply because realities have deemed it an actual fact, that we're talking about a reality right now, not something which is theoretical and not merely on an ideological or philosophical level, but something in reality. And people have found that democracy actually not only works, but it's in their best interest. Even those who used to oppose the idea of democracy in Islam and the marriage of Islam and democracy in the way that was being discussed. The issue is, I think, is of two levels. And I would warn against mixing the two, and that is the idea or ideological issue, and then the method itself, the application. And I think that the second, the latter, is the most important in our case, because all those who ideologically spoke against democracy for decades before, when the time came and the opportunity was there, they actually fell in line within the practice of democracy. So the method is what is important here, and ideas, to be honest, we can throw those about as much as we want, but at the end at the end where we're talking about the application of democracy, and when the time came for Arab, for Muslim communities, societies, for groups, organizations and parties, they actually espouse democracy, and I think that is what matters. But I also would like to end with what Dr. Masmoudi mentioned, and that is the crux of the whole issue. The problem is that talking about Islam and democracy, the real reason why it was so difficult was the fact that the realities were so abhorrent to the idea, and let alone the implication or the application of democracy. And that is the biggest problem. You mentioned certain countries where, to a large degree, democratic practice is a given. In Pakistan, Malaysia, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Turkey, and such, which accommodate hundreds of millions of Muslims who don't even think about asking the question. The question is being asked in countries where, unfortunately, dictatorships and despotic regimes persist, and that, I think, is quite an interesting point.
Ms. Hassan.
Yeah, in terms of, if your question means how do Muslims perceive democracy or the idea of democracy, I think after the Arab Spring, they have made it very clear in countries like Egypt and Tunisia and elsewhere that this is a value that they aspire for, but they have been prohibited from practicing their rights to choose their representatives for decades. And the problem was not the Brotherhood or Islamic parties or any other party, but the problem was the military dictatorships that existed for over 60 years. So I think that Muslims in so many countries have proved that they respect the ideals of democracy as understood here in the West, both in terms of the thick definition and the thin definition of democracy, whether as just electoral democracy or as the values that come with democracy, such as respecting the rule of law and human rights and civil liberties, etc.
Next question is...
Okay, what I can now is invite my colleagues to focus the questions on, perhaps probably on an individual for much of the time. If you violently disagree with the answer that's been given, please make it clear, and we'll also want to hear. But we'll see if we can now move things along reasonably pace here by just inviting one of you to comment on each question.
My question is to Mr. Masmoudi. Another's party conference last month drew a clear distinction between the Anada's religious and political activities. Can you explain what that means? And is there an implication that Anada is becoming a more, quote, a secular party?
I think what Nahda is trying to do is to separate religious activities from political activities. Nahda, like most other Islamic movements, started basically as a religious movement in the 70s, basically calling people to religion, to prayer, to fasting, to observing religion. And there was a crisis of identity in Tunisia. I lived through that in the 70s. Then it has evolved, and it is evolving into a political party. And Nahda sees that these two things have to be separated, that people who are calling for religion or having religious activities should not be also leaders of political parties. Because when we are calling for religion or religious values, these things, at least in Tunisia, they unite us, because Tunisia, we are all Muslim. They should not divide us. We don't want division in the mosques. We don't want division in religious matters. I mean, there are differences of opinions, but the political differences should stay in the political sphere, in the political institutions. So we don't think that secularism is a separation of values. The values are the same, but the institutions have to be separated. The political institutions and the religious institutions should be separated. And so those who want to work in political sphere, in political parties, they should concentrate on what political parties do, which is, running for elections, developing programs, trying to govern or governing coalitions, or if you're in opposition, trying to offer ideas. And if you want to work in religious matters, that should be separate, because you're calling for religion that has nothing to do with a particular political party. That should be for all Tunisians, no matter what their political affiliations are. So it's trying to separate the two, because these two should be separated. The political institutions should be separated from religious institutions, for the benefit of both, for the benefit of religious institutions and political institutions. And if I could add one more point, very important, why I think Islam is compatible with democracy, because we don't have anybody who speaks in the name of Islam. Nobody can represent God on earth in Islamic thinking. These are all just opinions. And so nobody in the Muslim world really believes that we want a religious state or a theocratic state, because we don't have a religious clergy, at least in Sunni Islam, which is at least 90% of Muslims in the world are Sunni Muslims. We do not have a religious clergy or a religious class of people that can speak in the name of God. We don't have such distinction. So I think the separation is a political party focus on politics and religious institutions focus on religion.
Does that mean to say that Al-Nahda and the Muslim Brotherhood are sort of heading in fundamentally different ideological directions?
I don't know, but I think it's possible that they are at different stages or different experiences. Certainly Tunisia is different from Egypt. These countries are not all the same. Saudi Arabia is not Turkey or Morocco. Each country has its own specificity. But Nahda has evolved. Nahda, by the way, even in 1981, when it started, when it first requested the permission to act as a political party in 1981, it said we want democracy, it said we don't want Sharia law, and it said we will respect democracy no matter what the outcome is. So it was actually very progressive in terms of accepting democratic values and democratic ideas, even in 1981.
Dr. Take-it, what do you...
Well, I think what's interesting in the Nahda experience is that this is generally a direction in which many a Muslim group, an Islamic group if you wish, is moving towards. This independent thinking of what serves the cause best. And I think that is what's most interesting. We see something on a similar but not identical level happening in various countries in the same region. For instance, the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan, which recently announced that it's disassociating itself from let's say the mothership in Egypt or whatever. And the same goes for various other countries and contexts. So I think that the interesting point about this is the fact that these groups are finding their footings in a new reality, addressing new demands and new challenges in a region that is changing quite rapidly, in a transformative era that is now heaping upon them questions, demanding of them serious answers, some of which are quite existential. The question of secularism, once again, I think that we reduce the whole issue when we speak merely about the issue of values. It's not. I would personally say that it's not essentially a bad thing to be told that you're espousing some of the values of secularism. I don't think that in itself is a bad thing. I think that what has happened in Nahda is that they have realized the problems and challenges faced by associated or sister organizations in various other countries, and that you can't govern and at the same time have your foot cemented in the civil society. It's simply impossible, and it's also impossible to carry your religious identity when you govern everyone in society who might not espouse to that particular or aspire to that particular identity. So I think that it's all happening in a transformative manner. The interesting bit about it is that the players within the spectrum of political Islam are responding to these questions, are realizing that we are living in these challenging times, these changing times, and they are responding positively. And I think that is what's interesting about the experience of Nahda.
Okay. Oh, yes.
No, sorry, maybe just coming about Egypt. I think after the Arab Spring, the Muslim Brotherhood has actually started along this track. They have, like when they participated in elections in 2011 and 2012, they actually established a separate political party. So they had the same aspiration, so to say, to have their own independent political work that is completely separate from the organization. I don't think the experience of Nahda is unique in that sense. I think in Egypt there has been attempts to start this, but of course the military coup of 2013 has obstructed the natural procession of the Muslim Brotherhood or other political parties to pursue this track.
Can I just come to the final set of questions, and that's to Mr. Munir. Do the branches of the Muslim Brotherhood in different states coordinate and act as coherent international movement?
You asked about the branches of the Muslim Brotherhood which
in different states coordinate and act as I suppose you could say one international movement or coherent international movement.
ابتداء
الفئة فوق الاخوان في الدول المختلفة التي تنسق.
ابتداء انا تعليقا على السؤال الماضي، يعني معنى العلمانية في بلادنا مختلف تماما في المنطقة العربية على الأقل أو في غيرها. معنى العلمانية مختلف تماما عما هو مفهومه في الغرب. العلمانيين في بلادنا فشلوا تماما في أن يقدموا ما هي مبادئ العلمانية التي تحترم حرية اختيار الناس الإنسان. هذا أصبح حقيقة واقعة. فالحديث عن العلمانية في بلادنا حديث للأسف الشديد يأتي بصورة قاتمة تعتمد عليها الأنظمة الدكتاتورية والعسكرية على أساس هي الأنظمة العلمانية.
Before I answer this, I just have a very brief comment on the previous question, that the secularism as a term or concept, it has a different meaning or connotation in our countries, different from what understood in the West. That's because of the experience that the secularists, mostly in our countries, have failed to present to the people a concept which respects the freedom of people in choice. And hence when the term is mentioned to the layman, it gives a negative response.
الدول بتعتمد على الدول الدكتاتورية بتعتمد عليها.
And the most of the dictator regimes have adopted, whether they believe in it or not, the secularism as a tool to impose their dictatorship on the people. And that, coupled with what mentioned earlier, tell us about the status of secularism in the mind, the Arab mind in general.
فروع الإخوان في خارج مصر كثيرة، يعني تسير حول فكر جماعة الإخوان المسلمين، وهو فكر لا يتعارض مع أصلا مع هوية هذه الشعوب. على سبيل المثال أن الدستور المصري الذي تم إقراره في 2014 سنة 2014 وشارك فيه مندوبين أقدم كنيسة في العالم الكنيسة المصرية، أقر في نص الدستور أن الشريعة الإسلامية مبادئ الشريعة الإسلامية مصدر للقانون، بمعنى أن الشعب المصري نفسه مثل باقي الشعوب التي توجد فيها حركات إخوان المسلمين تعتمد الشريعة الإسلامية في هذه القوانين، فليست هناك مفارقة أو يعني عمل مضاد للعمل الوطني التي تقوم به هذه الفروع داخل أوطاننا.
Answering the question regarding the branches of Ikhwan outside Egypt, there are numerous groups in different countries which adopt the ideology or the thought of Muslim brothers. And when we come to this thought, we'll find that I'm coming to that. That it is in line with the aspirations and the understanding of the people. I'll give you an example. In Egypt, for instance, the last constitution, which was issued in 2014, after the Ikhwan gone from the power, it was written in collaboration and with the participation of the delegates of the oldest or the most ancient church in the world, that's the Coptic Church. And that constitution stipulates clearly that Sharia is a source of legislation. And that tells that this is part of the culture of our people, that they find that the Sharia is compatible and it is constitutional to be mentioned in this way.
The question was, do the branches of the Muslim Brotherhood in other countries coordinate?
تنسيق فعلا بين الإخوان، بعضهم كل فروع الإخوان أو كل من ينتمي إلى فكر الإخوان المسلمين في العالم كله تقريبا هناك تنسيق، وهذا التنسيق موجود في أكثر من دولة حول المبادئ. وابتداء نحن لا ننسق مع أحد مخالف لقانون بلاده أو ليس في لائحته الداخلية أن هناك هيكلية التنظيم، بحيث أن لا تكون قيادة إلا أن تأتي لابد أن تأتي القيادة عن طريق الشورى وعن طريق القاعدة بانتخابات حرة ومستمرة، وليست هناك قيادة دائمة.
Yes, of course, there is a coordination between those who share the same belief or same ideology in more than one country. And that definitely rotates around the principles. And but we have two rules govern our coordinations. That we don't coordinate with someone who is outlawed or violates the law of the country. Secondly, we don't coordinate with the leadership of a group unless it came through the election or the agreement of the membership.
ليس بالضرورة أن يكون اسم الإخوان المسلمين أو نفس مناهج الإخوان المسلمين، إنما نعتمد هذا التنسيق أن يأتي في إطار كما يعني مبدأ الإطار الإسلامي الشامل الذي يسعى إلى عمل الدنيا واليوم الآخر.
We don't put as a prerequisite for coordination that the group or groups bear the name of Ikhwan Muslimin, nor that they adopt our own programs and education programs. But what we are looking for and we consider is that the major idea that Islam is a whole and that it covers the acts in this life and in the hereafter or for the hereafter.
العمل في داخل الأقطار لابد أن يتم بسلمية كاملة بعيدا عن أي عنف أو أي تهديد أو أي إجبار للأفراد على أنهم ينضموا لهذا التنظيم.
And work in different countries should be peaceful and free from any threat or any coercion to any person or persons to participate or to become part of it.
بالتأكيد هناك اهتمام بالقضايا العالمية، هناك اتفاق حول هذه القضايا أو اختلاف عليها، إنما تظل في مبدأ واحد وهو محاولة إفشاء السلام بمعناه الحقيقي على الأرض كلها قدر ما نستطيع، رغم ما نعانيه من أحيانا من ظلم الأنظمة كما يحدث في مصر أو في بعض البلاد العربية مثل سوريا وليبيا بهذه الصورة.
Surely there are issues which concern everyone in the world, and we as well. And we agree and disagree sometimes regarding these issues and quests. But there is one principle which we never abandon. That is that we have to work to bring peace to this earth. Despite what we face of persecution and ill treatment as it happens in Egypt, for instance, in the last few years.
Okay, John Barron.
Can I direct my question initially to Dr. Al-Jafidi, if I may? The Muslim Brotherhood Review, commissioned by the Prime Minister, and I repeat what the Chairman said, if anybody's got a strong view on this, then please come in with your answers. But it was commissioned, and although it said that the Brotherhood opposed terrorism in the UK, it was broadly critical of the Brotherhood. Can I take your view as your reaction to that review? Do you think it was fair?
The review is problematic on several levels. And I also mentioned part of this in my submission. I mentioned that there is the logistical issue of how the review came about, and then the running or the administration of the review before it was delivered, and the delay that's happened, and then the delivery itself, and plus then we have the content. In terms of the review itself, I would argue that it was flawed from the point of conception, from the point of departure. It sent absolutely the wrong message. The remit was unclear, at least to the general public who had an interest in following the progress of the review panel headed by Sir John Jenkins. Usually such reviews are held amid something that had happened. You'd expect that something had happened in regards to the Muslim Brotherhood beforehand, particularly that its remit was about the UK. Something that has happened that had called for the review to happen. The fact of the matter is, and this is something that we wrote about at the Qur'an Foundation, held a conference suggesting this, and we said that the Muslim Brotherhood, in terms of their individuals, arrived in the UK in the late 60s, and they've existed since then in individuals and groups and associations, and they've built pillars of the Muslim community, and they've done some tremendous work. They've mostly been professionals who've contributed to the country in various ways and means, and there has never been an incident in which a member of the Muslim Brotherhood or any of those groups breaking the law or committing any particular crime. And therefore the review itself and calling for the review was slightly odd. That's from the departure point of view. The biggest problem from my point of view is the issue of the delay. I mean, if you recall, the Prime Minister said that upon announcing the review, that a statement would be made before the adjournment of Parliament that year, i.e. July of 2014. In actual fact, the statement came 18 months later. Now, that is problematic for a number of reasons. The main is that if there was anything within the report submitted by Sir John Jenkins that suggested or merely hinted that the Muslim Brotherhood were engaged or were involved or were advocating somehow or another violence, terrorism, extremism, then sitting on it for 18 months would in itself be highly problematic, I suggest. But at the same time, that delay came with the constant casting of doubts and question marks as to what might be said and might not be said. It became sort of a tedious game in which there was a lot of disparagement, there was a lot of room for accusation. Particularly, you have to understand this, that whilst we were sitting here probably somehow understanding the mechanics and how this could be delayed and how the delay could be understandable, the regimes that were repressing the Muslim Brotherhood and their supporters and anyone who was suspected to be part of the network were using our silence and were using that delay for their own agendas. So that delay was problematic on so many levels. And then the delivery of the statement, which came at a time which was problematic. It came in the final hours before the adjournment for Christmas on the 17th of December. There was no room for appeal, for reply, for response, for coming back before the new year. And also, I may contend that the report itself it came to nothing. It came to no conclusion. Basically, it said, well, there's a big question mark, which is precisely the point which we departed from in announcing the review in April of 2014. The content itself is also, I mean, we could speak about the statement delivered, because the report itself is now kept confidentially, so we're not going to see that for a number of years. But the statement that was given by the Prime Minister, I think, was also full of problems, not least because it ventured times into the ideology and theory and theocracy, and times in the political and pragmatist and mechanisms and dynamics, and much of it was conjecture. It was guessing. It was building on certain events that happened at a certain point of history, sometimes several decades ago, and relating to that in modern time Britain. I feel that the review from start to finish was littered with problems. I think it taught us nothing. I think we learned nothing. The taxpayer has paid a handsome sum for learning absolutely nothing. The delay in which the government...
Can I press you on that, though, just very briefly? And I do want to bring in Ms. Assam, if I may. I mean, you say we learned nothing. It came out, the executive summary. I agree that the body of the report we haven't seen. But it came out with some pretty harsh conclusions. I mean, one of them was that the Brotherhood has an ideological basis for legitimising violence and is prepared to use violence to pursue its goals. I mean, that's pretty harsh, whichever way you look at it. Now, is that fair in your view? And I'd like to bring in Ms. Assam with regards to that answer as well, specifically that issue of violence.
I would, as a straight answer, I would say that no, it's not fair, simply because the evidence in terms of how that theological or ideological base translated in terms of practices is null. There was no outpour of violence everywhere where the Muslim Brotherhood was. In fact, if anything, there were times when when actually political Islam became engaged with society simply because it totally renounced and rejected the use of any terms of violence. But just to come back to the issue of whether we learnt anything, that in itself teaches us nothing whatsoever, because that accusation has always been there. And that accusation is thrown about with respect, with dictatorial governments who are, trying to crush the Muslim Brotherhood. So it's out there anyway. It's nothing. We didn't learn anything new. Once again, I say we didn't learn anything new. We basically ended exactly where we started off from.
Thank you. Can I bring in Mr. Sam? I mean, your view on that particular.
Yeah, on the issue of violence. On the issue of violence, I think the conclusions of the review are very much unsubstantiated, and I think they're very misleading. They fail to contextualize what's happening in Egypt. They fail to mention the evidence, the very clear evidence that the Brotherhood, despite the brutal repression after the coup, has still abided by peacefulness. And I think this should be the test, like how did the Brotherhood react when they were themselves the victims of violence? And interestingly, they have not even reacted to the violence of the coup, despite their own leaders being sentenced to death, despite even the general guide or the top leader of the Brotherhood, his own son, was actually killed in the demonstrations that followed the coup, and he himself in that context made a very strong statement about violence, and he said our peacefulness is stronger than their bullets, and that is a very well documented speech that he made after the massacres that took place after the coup. And I think it's very important to on the issue of violence to follow the Brotherhood's reactions. I think if anything, the Brotherhood in Egypt have been the victims of violence, of political violence, especially violence committed by the state since the regime of Gamal Abdel Nasser, and followed by the other dictatorial military regimes until the regime of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. And I think what should be condemned at this point is the indiscriminate violence committed by the regime of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the military establishment in Egypt, against politicians from across the political spectrum, including the Muslim Brotherhood, who have been the target of most violence and state-sponsored terror.
Does anybody else have any answers to those two questions? Anybody would like to come in? Dr. Masmoud.
Three very good points. I think it is very disappointing and shameful on Western countries in general when we side with autocratic regimes in the Arab world because we have some interests with them. This has been ongoing for 40 or 50 years. This is the main problem that we have to face. My own country, the United States, where I've been living for 35 years, there is a specific law passed by Congress that bans giving any support to a country where there's been a military coup. Any support, financial or political or any support, it's a law. So the way the government did around it is we're not going to call it a military coup. It is ironic. It discredits all of us. It discredits the process. The whole world knows that it is a military coup, that what happened in Egypt is a military coup. And therefore what we are doing in the United States is supporting illegally an illegal regime and illegally giving support to such a regime. And I think also on the point of the Brotherhood, we disagree on many things with the Brotherhood, but certainly they've never advocated violence. This is on record for the last 70 years. They've never advocated violence. Yes, there are members who disobey or leave the Brotherhood because they lose patience, because of the state violence. The main problem is the state violence. People are dying in jail. People are being raped in jail. You know, if you hear the testimonies of people who came out of jail or who died in jail or their families, you know, it's very, very moving. It's very painful. And so the silence of the West versus these regimes is extremely dangerous, and I think is the main cause for the rise of violence and extremism, because people are losing hope in Egypt, you know, or elsewhere. If they lose hope in democracy, where are they going to turn? They're going to turn to violence. And so we have to stop the supporting these oppressive regimes, and we have to say enough is enough. If the Muslim Brotherhood made mistakes, they pay for it at the ballot box. That's how democracy works, not by military coups.
Very, very finally, can I just bring in Mr. Munir? Dr. Masmoudi has a point, does he not?
Actually, he wanted to take part in this because you asked everyone.
Yeah, please do.
حقيقة التقرير عندما يقول إنه الإخوان عندهم استعداد للعنف أو مارسوا العنف، هذا الكلام، هذا التقرير الحقيقة، هذا الحكم أغفل 60 سنة على الأقل بيتكلم عن الإخوان المسلمين في مصر من أكثر من عهد الانقلاب العسكري الكولونيل جمال عبد الناصر. الحكم العسكري يحكم مصر منذ 1952 حتى الآن. هذا الكلام يأتي ولم يثبت حادثة واحدة أن الإخوان المسلمين طوال هذا التاريخ قاموا بعمل عنف. عندما يأتي محكمة عسكرية تحكم ولا تعطي المتهم حرية الدفاع ولا تعطي أي أحد آخر أن يدافع عن هذا المتهم، ويحضر المتهم وهو معذب ثم تأتي المحكمة العسكرية لتحكم أنه قام بعنف أو كان ينوي أن يقوم بعنف، يصبح هذا الكلام، أصبح هذا التاريخ وتعتمد عليه الدراسات. أعتقد أنه ليس في فكر جماعة الإخوان المسلمين على الإطلاق الدعوة إلى العنف أو اللجوء إلى العنف. هناك قضية ممكن تهيئ.
I would say that the conclusion mentioned earlier regarding the ideology of Muslim Brotherhood has overlooked 60 years plus of military rule in Egypt, which started in 52 by the coup then of Colonel Nasser. And throughout all these decades, there was no proof at all that Muslim Brotherhood committed any single act of violence. There were martial courts, military courts, which dealt with the detained Muslim brothers. And throughout the trials, they prevented all the accused of defending themselves and preventing the defense from playing its role. And they brought these detainees to the court after being tortured. And then they verdict that they are terrorists and they are violent people and judge them according to that. So this is the real situation, and if unfortunately that what was reproduced in the literature in Egypt and copied by others to become this pseudo history of the Muslim brothers, and hence we see such views.
التقرير أشار إلى الأستاذ سيد قطب باعتباره كان يدعو إلى العنف، وهذا الكلام من يقرأ كتابة سيد قطب يدرك تماما أنه لم يدعو إلى العنف. إضافة إلى أنه سيد قطب في هذه الفترة التي بدأ يكتب فيها كانت المنطقة كلها، المنطقة العربية كلها تقريبا في مواجهة فكر ماركسي، فالرجل كان يدافع عن دينه في مقابل الفكر الماركسي. هذا التعبير سيد قطب في هذه الفترة كان يدخل معركة نيابة عن كل دول المنطقة. عندما قرر عبد الناصر إعدامه تدخل الملك فيصل السعودي باعتباره حسب منهاجه، والرئيس الجزائري الاشتراكي، والرئيس العراقي الذي كان يوجه البعث في العراق، وأيضا الملك حسين. هذه الأنظمة.
Mr. Munir, you're making it quite difficult for your interpreter.
The report also talked about Sayyid Qutb and accused him that he preached violence. And whoever reads Sayyid Qutb will discover that he did not preach any violence. Add to that the whole zone or the whole area in the time he was writing was in a full ideological confrontation between Islam and Marxism. And Qutb was representing the Islamic view, and he was defending his own ideology. So he was acting on behalf of every Muslim who believes in Islam and does not accept. Sorry, the whole area, the whole zone, he was defending its own entity. And when Nasser decided to hang him, three heads of states at least interfered, asking to dilute this verdict. Was King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, was the socialist president of Algeria, and the president of Iraq, who was a nationalist. So these three figures were appreciating what could be said, and hence they interfered. But unfortunately, Nasser did not.
الأصل في الحرية، إذا تكلمنا عن الحرية والديمقراطية، الأصل في الحرية أن الفكر يعالج بالفكر. إذا كان هناك فكر مخالف لابد أن يعالج بالفكر وليس بالقتل. ومع ذلك سيد قطب وهو عضو في جماعة الاخوان المسلمين، المرشد العام الثاني القاضي حسن الهضيبي أصدر كتابا مشهورا أغلب الباحثين يحاولون الآن إخفاءه. هذا الكتاب يصحح في أي فكر ممكن أن يؤخذ من فكر سيد قطب أو غيره، حتى لا يتشدد أفراد الإخوان المسلمين، وحتى لا يتصور أحد أن هذا التشدد أو العنف الذي ممكن يأتي عن التشدد سيأتي بخير. هذا مخالف لفكر الإخوان المسلمين ومخالف لما نفهمه من ديننا.
It is a basic thing in freedom that thought should be confronted by thought, not by killing and murdering. And Qutb was a thinker, and he was writing. And when the guide, by the way, the word supreme guide is wrong, is general guide in Ikhwan. The guide of Ikhwan at the time, Judge Hassan al-Hudaybi, had issued in that time of the writings of Qutb a book which unfortunately is fought, and its title is Dua La Quda, means we are preaching or advocating what we believe and not judging the others, in which he tried to clarify the whole matter to make it impossible for some of the youngsters who were trying to utilize the ideas or their own interpretation of the ideas of Qutb to be justification for violent actions.
حادثتين تاريخيتين أخيرا في منتصف الثمانينات في مصر.
Order. The meeting will be suspended whilst we have to go and vote in the House of Commons.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
If we can resume the meeting. Order. And I'd like to invite my colleague Nadim Zahawi to pick up the questioning.
Thank you. We were waiting for...
Was in the middle of his speech when you had the point of order. So if you allow him to continue.
No, quite right. Let's go complete the answer.
هذا كنت كلمة حادثتين تاريخيتين.
يعني thank you. بالنسبة لسيد قطب، سيد قطب أنا أقول الآن تاريخيا في هذه الجلسة التاريخية أيضا أن سيد قطب دافع عن الهجوم الماركسي على المنطقة بفكره طوال هذه الفترة، ولولا أفكار سيد قطب لا تصورنا أن الفكر الماركسي طغى على المنطقة كلها. لا أتكلم عن الإسلام أو مسيحية أو غيرها، ولقد تغيرت جغرافية المنطقة وتاريخ المنطقة في هذا الوقت.
I would like to thank you first, and I have to raise a certain historic fact in this particular historic session, that Sayyid Qutb defended the whole area against the Marxist attack throughout his period, and thanks to this, among other things, that this attack failed. And if he was not there, and if he did not do that job, it might have been that the whole area or the whole region could have changed, including Muslims, Christians, and all the components there.
يعني الكتاب الذي أصدره مرشد الجماعة أو رئيس الجماعة حدد أي مخالف له حتى لو فهم كلام سيد قطب، واحد من داخل جماعة الاخوان المسلمين فاهم كلام سيد قطب بالخطأ، لابد أن يعود عنه. هذا الكتاب أصبح الذي لا يقتنع بفكره يخرج خارج دائرة الاخوان المسلمين.
The book which the guide of the time, Judge Hudaybi, wrote about preachers, not judges, had established a rule that anyone who is tending to misinterpret the ideas, to go towards violence, is outside the brotherhood.
للأسف التقرير لم يأتي على هذا الموضوع، لم يتكلم في هذا الموضوع، وترك الأمر بحيث أنه القارئ العادي يفهم أن الإخوان المسلمين فعلا كانوا يدعون إلى العنف أو يلجؤون للعنف في بعض السياسات كما ذكر التقرير.
Unfortunately, the report or the review did not find these facts, and on the contrary, it suggests that the Muslim brothers are calling for violence, or they are or utilizing violence and using it to serve their own political agenda.
في أحداث يعني أنا أرجو صدرك تسمع لها. في وسط الثمانينات حسني مبارك كان ضابط وأيضا عسكري، كانت هناك أزمة اقتصادية وأزمة اجتماعية شديدة في مصر، وبدأت الجماعة الإسلامية ما يسمى الجماعة الإسلامية العنف في مصر، وكاد النظام يسقط فعلا. وهناك دفع كثير. ناس كانوا يقولون الإخوان لماذا لا تشارك وهي فرصة لإسقاط النظام العسكري، ومع ذلك رفض الإخوان المشاركة في هذا الموضوع لأنه ضد مبادئهم حتى لو كان حسني مبارك يظلمهم.
In mid-80s, Hosni Mubarak, who originally was a military man, was facing acute crisis in Egypt, and this crisis, which has a very deep economic grievance, had led to the rise of violence by an Islamic group called the Islamic group, Al-Jama'ah Islamiyah, and it escalated its operations to extent that it seemed to threaten the whole regime. And many people approached Ikhwan and wondered why the brothers, approached the brothers and wondered why the brothers don't seize the opportunity and join forces with this small group and get the chance to get rid of Mubarak, who was persecuting them. And the brothers' answer was simple: this is against our belief. We don't believe in violence, and they did not take part in such action.
Mr. Munir, we are quite limited to time. We've got quite a lot I want to get through, and there is obviously significant substance in the points you're making. I would invite a written submission. We've had plenty, and it might be more appropriate to take some of this evidence in writing, if we may. So what I would invite him to complete the answer on the reaction, his view of the Muslim Brotherhood review in written form. And I'm now going to invite my colleague Nadim Zahawi to pick up other questions.
Only 1 minute. No. Okay.
1 minute.
التقرير ذكر أن أفراد من جماعة الإخوان المسلمين بعد الانقلاب العسكري ساهموا مع غيرهم في أعمال عنف في مصر، وذكر أيضا قيادات جماعة القانون استنكرت هذا الأمر، ولم يذكر التقرير ما يفعله قائد الانقلاب العسكري الذي أعطى لضباطه license to kill من غير أي حساب.
The report mentioned that after the coup d'etat, the CC1, that some members of the brothers had committed some or took part in acts of violence, and mentioned that the leaders of the brothers condemned that. But the report failed to mention that the leader of the coup had given a license to kill to all his men, the army and the police, in his speeches, and this was not mentioned.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman. Ramadan Kareem to all of you, and I know those of you who are fasting, it's a difficult time of the day, so we appreciate you coming here and making this very important contribution to our inquiry. You all mentioned dictatorial governments, and I get that, and it's noted here. But I just want to sort of set that aside for a second, because you all talked about democracy as well, and how political Islam is going to adopt or adapt to the 21st century. Part of that democracy is not just the ballot box, it's institutions, it's a independent judiciary. And I put it to you that the problem you have, really both in Tunisia and in Egypt, is that civil liberties, and I would say and equality, fall foul sometimes of Sharia law. And because the judicial system of Islam is Sharia law, you have problems with that. And Nahdha had when they tried to change the constitution, where women were not equal to men, and I think the Tunisian people pushed back, and quite rightly you're being pragmatic now and trying to sort of navigate a route through that. But in Egypt, you alienated half of your people because of clearly Sharia law hurting maybe people who happen to be gay, or people who are committed atheists and who may want to organize other atheists in that way. So the difficulty for you is actually Sharia law you cannot change, and it jars against those institutions that protect civil liberties and equality. And no matter, of course, put aside dictatorships, but when you took power in Egypt, you alienated half of your people. What happened next, we've discussed. I really just want to get your take on, it's almost impossible to deal with that aspect of political Islam unless you denounce Sharia law. So would you denounce it and move away from it to try and protect the rights? Democracy is judged by how it protects its minorities, not just the will. Many of you talked about the people. The people are not all the same.
Take my first
of course.
shot. I completely agree with what you said.
So you're denouncing Sharia law?
Well, I'll tell you, except that what you said, Sharia law cannot change. This is not true, actually. What is Sharia? Sharia is interpretations.
So how does it interpret looking after gay people?
So Sharia law can be interpreted and can be changed, and has been changed all the time throughout history.
Right.
So the problem is what is Sharia? There is no clear definition of what we mean by Sharia law. And this is why the Nahda party, we had elections in 2011, and the new Constituent Assembly started in 2012, beginning of 2012. Within 2 months, February and March, there were discussions in Tunisia about whether we're going to include Sharia law in the constitution as one of the sources, not the only source, but one of the sources of legislation in the constitution. Within the Nahda party, there were about 15 meetings of the Shura Council, which is elected body of 150 people from all over the country. They met almost weekly for 2 months to discuss this point. And then they voted with 80%. It's not even close. With 80% not to include Sharia in the constitution. With 80%. And this was 2 months into the process. There was nothing there was no pressure from the street or anything like that. From the beginning.
Well, there was pressure during the constitution.
No, the constitution hasn't, we were starting the process. There was no, I'm saying there was pressure later.
Yes.
But this is from the beginning. Nahda took a position. We're not going to require or insist or demand that Sharia be mentioned at all in the constitution. There is one clause, the first clause in the old constitution, which says that Tunisia is a republic whose language is Arabic and whose religion is Islam. And they said that is enough. That's all we need. We don't need Sharia in the constitution because Sharia can be misinterpreted. We certainly don't want the Sharia of the Taliban or of Al-Qaeda or of Daesh. If that is what they mean by Sharia, then we certainly don't want that. So, no, and in fact, Sharia in Arabic, you probably know, means rule of law. That's all it means. And Sharia can be interpreted and has been interpreted, and we need a new Sharia for the 21st century. We reject the old interpretations. Those were good interpretations for their times, but their times were 1,000 years ago.
Yeah, there's Mr. Linnear's commentary on that.
الحقيقة موضوع الشريعة وما يقال عنها خارج الإطار البحثي الحقيقي قد يؤدي إلى سوء فهم كثير. إنما ما أستطيع أن أقوله الآن أن الشريعة ممكن أن نقسمها جزئين. الجزء الخاص بالإلهيات والعبادة والصلة بالله أو باليوم الآخر، وهذه أمور لا تتغير. الشريعة نفسها نزلت لمصالح الناس. إذا كانت هناك مصالح للناس لا تتعارض مع هذه الأمور، فمصالح الناس، مصالح الحياة هي المقدمة في هذا الأمر. إضافة أمر
The subject of Sharia, what could be said about it if it is discussed outside a true investigation atmosphere or environment, it may lead to misunderstandings. But I can say simply that Sharia consists of two components. The first one of them is the divinities, things dealing with, and these are constant, don't change. But Sharia as a whole is aimed for the public interest, for the interest of the people. Wherever the interest is, Sharia is keen to serve and to offer.
Yes, but forgive me if I push back on that. You say it's in the interest of the people, but if some of the people, a minority, want to be non-believers or want to be gay, how will the Sharia treat them?
لكن هناك جزء من الناس حتى لو صغير يريد أن يكون شاذ أو أن يكون ملحد، فكيف أنتم تعاملون معه؟
الشريعة فيها نص قرآني نازل أنه للإنسان من حقه أن يكفر أو لا يكفر، أن يؤمن بأن فيه وجود إله أو لا يؤمن بوجود إله. هذا أقصى ما يمكن أن تفعله الشريعة، أن أكون في مجتمع مسلم ولا أؤمن أن في إله، أنا حر في ذلك. أنت وليس من حق الحاكم حتى لو كان مسلما أو من حق المجتمع أن يجبره أنه يؤمن بالإله. نص قرآني يقول أنت تكره الناس حتى يقولوا مؤمنين، يقول هذا للنبي نفسه. القرآن يقول للنبي ليس من حقك أن تكره الناس حتى يكونوا مؤمنين.
In Sharia or in Islam there is the Quranic text, which is the highest. In that text it states clearly that it is for man to believe or to disbelieve. Who wants to believe, believes. Who does not want to believe, does not believe. So there is no, So I think this is cannot be better than that or cannot be stronger than that as a statement. Another statement which explains or stipulates that it is not at all in the right of the ruler to coerce or force people to believe. And the Quran is addressing Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, telling him in a wandering way, would you be forcing people to become believers in such denial style that he is denying that he would think of doing that? So these two states or statements of the Quran are fixed. You cannot change them. They are part of the Quran.
تبقى حريات الناس في الاختيار في الحياة العادية مثلها مثل أي مجتمع في الدنيا. لكل مجتمع مقاييسه، لكل مجتمع مثله. حتى في هذه الحريات الإنسان حر لأن الله هو الذي يحاسبه في اليوم الآخر في الحدود حسب ما تقول كل القوانين، في حدود العرف العام الموجود في المجتمع. يعني فأنا يبقى الإنسان حر في اختياره في حياته في حدود العرف العام الموجود في المجتمع دون أي تداخل أو دون أي عنف يؤخذ من طرف ضد طرف بهذه الصورة.
Add to that in any society or any community you have also the norms, and these general norms usually govern people and direct them. But the freedom no one can take from it because it's not from the other people or from these norms, it is from God who give it to man. So no one should take from that. But when people have their own life and decide which way to live, they always in any society take in account the general norm because it is a guideline and it has its own manifestation in the laws which man made to organize his own society and community. And if someone is violating that, is not to be met with the violence or with the force. There are other ways to deal with that.
So as long as you're within the norms, that's fine. Just one, I'll let you come back in 1 second. I just wanted to really one last question to both Mr. Munir, but maybe Shundus can also answer. So why do you think that you lost 50% of your voters, that actually they rejected the Brotherhood's rule?
لماذا كان التصويت يعني لكم في حوالي 50% ضد في الانتخابات؟
هذه هي الديمقراطية.
This is democracy.
This is democracy.
Fair enough. We'll come back to that later. Let me actually. I've got some factual questions, and you can maybe deal with those because I'm going to come to you as well, Mr. Masmoudi. Who sets the policies at another party?
Who sets the policies? There is the Congress, which we just had one 2 weeks ago or 2.5 weeks ago, which is by elected people, about 1,200 people. They met. That's the highest institution in the party. And then there is the elected Shura Council, also 150 people, and they set the policy. They set the policy between the two congresses.
And are the Shura, is that the religious figures?
No. These are elected people.
How does the religious figures fit into policy making?
We are all religious. I mean, there is no religious people.
Right. So it's everybody's equal.
You're not.
There's no hierarchy.
There is no hierarchy, and we reject any hierarchy, and we reject even the term religious scholars or religious people. You know. Yeah.
And for the Brotherhood, who sets the policy?
Can I add one sentence about that?
Of course.
It's very important. Because Sheikh Rashid Ghannouchi just 2 months ago was asked, they told him in an interview that what you're doing is against Sharia. He said, no, the Constitution is the new Sharia. Because that is how we come up with Sharia. It is the consensus of all Tunisians. We all met together and we wrote the new laws. Yeah. That is the new Sharia.
I know that you have a question on this particular point because I think it is important. Once again, I mean, we're talking about a term that's used and abused and used in any particular way. And I agree with the definition given by that essentially Sharia is something which is in evolution. It's evolving all the time. It's moving all the time. And it's changing according to context. How it's moving over here is different from how it's moving in Southeast Asia and the such. But let's just state a few facts. The first is that every single Muslim government, as far as I know, and I stand to be corrected, including the most vehemently anti-religious of them, the most secular, if you wish, of them, have the very first line in their constitution that Sharia is the basis for the constitution. So that's one thing. And therefore Sharia isn't the issue to be asked of Islamic parties, the Muslim Brotherhood or otherwise. The societies demand Sharia. And the example that Ibrahim Munir gave earlier in terms of the 2014 constitution, whereby the Coptic Church was heavily involved and engaged in drafting the constitution, actually the term emphasizing Sharia was far stronger than the constitution proposed by Mohammed Morsi during his rule. So I think that's extremely important. The issue about sidelining, I think it's been said, you always have 50% who aren't happy. But the problem with Egypt particularly, and this is what we try to convince the European Union as well as our own government, in that we need to either announce our total adoption of democracy, or say that, well, actually we will only adopt democracy and stand by it and support it when it suits us. And the issue is that, yes, there will always be 50% who aren't happy with the democratic outcome. But are we committed enough to actually stand by, the choice that the ballot box actually gave? And just one final point. You mentioned, and this is an extremely important point, and one of the issues that are now being talked about in various circles, about the issue of minorities, about the situation, status of women, about laws pertaining to minorities, whether they be religious, whether they be cultural, or the such. This is very, very important. During the time of Mohammed Morsi, and these are facts and statistics, we don't have time to go through them, but I will tell you this. Never, ever, throughout the history of modern Egypt, since the fall of the monarchy, did the Copts actually have a share in power as they did during the time of Mohammed Morsi. Never did they have a vice president apart from when Mohammed Morsi was in power. Never did they have the numbers that they did in the upper house of parliament as they did during the time of Mohammed Morsi. The same goes for women. So the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood actually sidelined minorities is false from the factual point of view.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I just really want to get through some of these very quick fire questions. So in terms of the Brotherhood, Mr. Munir, sets the policies for the Brotherhood?
من يضع السياسات الاخوان؟
مجلس تنظيم الاخوان في مجلس شورى مثل يوازي البرلمان ولا ثم اللجنه العليا تسمى مكتب ارشاد بالتوافق مع مكتب الارشاد ومجلس الشورى تتم هذه السياسات وليس برأي واحد فقط يعني.
And what role is played by the... Oh, sorry, I understood it. My apologies.
The organization of the internal organization of Muslim Brothers has includes or mainly the Shura Council, and as explained earlier, Shura is like a parliament where all ideas to be discussed and then come to conclusion. And also the highest executive organ, which is the Office of Guidance, and that office works closely and jointly with the Shura Council in drawing and implementing the policies.
So that's the supreme guide and his deputies?
هل هو ده المرشد العام والنائب؟ لا المكتب أكثر. It is bigger than that. It is a bureau which contain various members. How many? About 17 people, and they are elected. كما حفظت الإضافة المكتب ينتخب ولا؟
المكتب ينتخب من مجلس الشورى.
Yes, it is appointed through election, and they work jointly with the, and from them I think the guide.
ليست هناك قاعدة واحدة عند كل الإخوان إن في مصر حوالي 17 عضو ينتخبوا من القاعدة من مجلس الشورى.
It varies from country to country, but I'm talking about Egypt. Now 17 members elected by the Shura people.
How many members does the Muslim Brotherhood have, either in Egypt or worldwide?
كم أعضاء الإخوان مع الإخوان في مصر وفي العالم؟
Even يعني حتى الحكومات لا تستطيع.
Even the governments don't know.
But do you know how many members you have in Egypt?
ما تعرفش في مصر؟
لا أحد يستطيع.
No one can.
لأن هذه مسائل تعتبر خاصة عند كل قطر وعند كل جماعة. إنما في مصر عدد المصوتين من الإخوان الذين لهم حق التصويت داخل جماعة الإخوان المسلمين بعدما يمر بعدة مراحل قبل أن يكون له حق التصويت الآن قرابة 900,000 أو مليون.
The membership in Brotherhood is different grades, and until you reach the highest you can have the vote. Those who register that they have acquired the right to vote are 900,000. But the total members are much more than that.
Much more than that. How many members does Nahda have in Tunisia or worldwide?
About 110, 120,000.
Mr. Munib, do members swear an oath?
قسم العضو هل يؤدي قسم عند دخول الجماعة؟
يعني أقول إنه ابتداء إنه هناك جمهور حول الإخوان المسلمين يعتبروا من المعاونين أو المتعاونين مع الإخوان المسلمين في بالنسبة في مصر. الآن حسب النسبة آخر انتخابات تمت.
لا هو سؤال كان غير كده. العضو هل يؤدي قسم؟
نوصل حوالي 30% من الذين حق لهم انتخاب داخل مصر. إنما بالنسبة للإخوان المسلمين هناك مراحل قبل أن يصل إلى مرحلة إنه عضو حقيقي أو عضو عامل في جماعة الإخوان المسلمين، وهو عندما يصبح عضو عامل في جماعة الإخوان المسلمين يؤدي قسم. هذا القسم يشابه تماما، وهو للأسف الشديد وهو يترجم بطريقة غير صحيحة، إنما يشابه تماما كل ما تفعله الجماعات الصوفية في مصر. هذا التقليد موجود من سنوات طويلة 200 أو 300 سنة ماضية والجماعة الإخوان المسلمين تعتبر نفسها أيضا طريقة صوفية، فهذا القسم تؤديه ليس الإخوان المسلمين فقط، إنما كل الجماعات الصوفية الموجودة في مصر بتؤديه، وهي بالمئات.
If we talk about the Ikhwan, there are, as I said, there are the full-fledged or the full-acting members, and they are surrounded by scores and scores of other brothers, but they are not reaching the grade of full membership yet. When a person reached to this level, he would give an oath, and that oath is a traditional one inherited for centuries and practiced by all Sufi orders. And until now, all the orders are following the same approach, that a member to be acknowledged and to be inaugurated in the way or the tariqah shall say the similar words. And we know from the beginning, the establishment of Ikhwan, that it had Sufism as part of its components or its ingredients.
الشيء المهم أنه طوال تاريخ الإخوان لم تعترض الدولة على هذا القسم، ولم تعترض أي جهة حزبية أو غير حزبية على هذا القسم، لأنه بيعتبروه شيء طبيعي في مجتمع هذا الأمر عنده أمر طبيعي.
Most important that throughout the history of Muslim Brothers, not a single government, not any public body or organization had contested or protested against this oath, because everyone take it as a natural thing and happening every day in various areas of the society.
بعض الجماعات يعني جمعيات المجتمع المدني مثل جماعة الاخوان المسلمين في داخل مصر أيضا لها نوع من القسم، بحيث أنه يعطي الوفاء لهذه الجمعية والعمل لها. أي بعض جمعيات المجتمع المدني التي لا
There are civil society organizations in Egypt which are not of the brother, part of the brother. They have their own oath which is very similar, and they practice it.
Mr. Munir mentioned that the oath has been sometimes unfortunately misinterpreted. Can you share the oath with us now? Can you repeat the oath?
بتقول ان بعض الناس ما اساءوا ترجمته او شرح القسم هذا. يعني انت في كلامك قلت ان في ناس لما ترجمت هذا القسم اساءت ترجمته، فهل تستطيع انك تقوله الان؟
لا، هذا الكلام نتصور انه
لا يعني نصه تعرف تقوله؟
يعني على ما اذكر
if I can remember.
يعني
must be a long time ago since
I did it for 60 years ago.
إذا بتقدر تعيده هلا.
أعهد الله على أن أطيع هذه الجماعة وأعمل لأفكارها وأسمع وأطيع لها ولقيادتها بهذا التعبير.
I pledge my oath to God to
أعمل لفكر هذه الجماعة.
To work for the ideas of this society.
وأسمع وأطيع لها قيادتها.
And to obey the commands of its leadership.
في غير معصية، في غير.
Without violating the orders of the commands of God.
Thank you very much indeed. My next question is to Sundus and to Anas. In your written submissions to us, you are sympathetic with the Muslim Brotherhood, and you're both perceived to have organizational links to the Brotherhood. But am I right? Neither of you are members of the Brotherhood.
I think that your question, perceived, I think is the magic word. I think it's perceived that there are organizations. There is no organization link with the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yeah.
But it's clear. personally as well as organizationally, the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood, the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood symbolizes something which the region as a whole, a region that has been bereft from humanity and democracy and freedoms and civil liberties for a century long at least, is in dire need of the ideological basis, the ideology of Islamic values entering all spheres of life, particularly in politics, in peaceful transformation and reform of society as well as governments, in terms of including everyone and excluding none. That ideological base I share entirely.
But you're not a member of the Brotherhood?
No, well, in Britain particularly, we don't have a Muslim Brotherhood. We don't have a Muslim Brotherhood organization.
But you're not a member of the Brotherhood anyway? This is my country. I belong to whatever organization there is here. Right.
And the closest there is to the Muslim Brotherhood, and which espouses the basic tenets of the Muslim Brotherhood ideology, is the Muslim Association in Britain, which I'm a member of, I'm a founding member of, I was a president of, and now I'm the chairman of.
And since you're not a member of the Brotherhood?
No, my answer is quite similar to Anna's. In Egypt, as I mentioned in my submission, I worked in the office of President Mohamed Morsi.
Yeah.
President Mohamed Morsi was the president of the Freedom and Justice Party, and before that he was an active member of the Brotherhood and the chairman of its political bureau for more than 10 years. I supported the FJP after the Arab Spring. It's not because I supported it per se, but I think that the Freedom and Justice Party after the revolution, in my perspective, was the most respectful of the democratic process. I think its ideology as a whole, I think I shared lots of the ideology of the Freedom and Justice Party. And it's important to note, you have asked me a question before that, but you didn't give me a chance to answer.
I apologize, it's just because the chairman was kicking me from under the desk.
Yeah. So, you have mentioned Sharia a couple of times, and yes, you've directed this question to the panel, and I would like to point out some historical facts here with regards to the Sharia in Egypt, historically, and the second article of the Egyptian constitution, which mentions explicitly that not Sharia, but the principles of Sharia as the source of legislation in the country. I think you in your question you said that, or you suggested that the Brotherhood or President Morsi alienated the majority of half Egyptians because allegedly he used this Sharia, or he used religion to alienate the others who don't share the same perspective, which I totally disagree with. I disagree with this allegation. So the second article actually, if you follow the history, it was first introduced in 1923. 1923 in Egyptian history, it's even before the Muslim Brotherhood was established. It was even before political Islam was even known as a term. And interestingly, the committee which has proposed the provision of stating that the Egyptians that Islam is the religion of the state in Egypt was actually proposed at that time by this committee, which interestingly was composed of Western educated jurists. One of them his name was Abdurrazak Sanhouri, and it included Coptic jurists, and it included a Jew at that time. And the Brotherhood was not even established at that time. And this term, when it was first, the second article, or the stating that the Egyptians, the religion of the Egyptian state is Islam, was actually understood at that time to mean that Sharia is the source of legislation, so to say. The explicit mention of Sharia as a source of legislation has been proposed by President Anwar Sadat in 1971, not by the Muslim Brotherhood, not by any Islamic party. And at that time, it was believed that he actually proposed that in order to gain the sympathy of some of Egyptians to propose other provisions in the constitution that would extend his term in power. So just my point is.
No, I get it. I've got it. Understood.
And,
all I wanted to ask
I
you.
think,
Sorry, I was just going to follow up for both of you.
Yeah.
I mean, you clearly believe in this stuff deeply, and rightly so. Why aren't you members of the Brotherhood?
If there came to be an organisation registered and operating under British laws and tax, then I probably might. I don't know, but I probably might. I mean, there's no impediment, but I don't see a reason for it. I mean, we as British Muslims, we have our own vision, our own mission. We have our own agenda. We have our own interactions, and carrying the basic tenets which represent, let's say, the backbone of the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood, I think is suffice. But we must operate it within the laws, whether they be whatever regulatory issues within Britain. So,
do you think that the Muslim Brotherhood is not required in a free society? Is that what you're saying?
No, I think that the tenets that the Muslim Brotherhood aspires to and promotes, I think they're quite valid in every society, and they would come. This is my point, and I try to make this clear in my submission. The problem of oppression is that it doesn't just violate human rights for, let's say, the Muslim Brotherhood or those who are against the coup. The problem is that it deprives those movements of the ability to evolve, to operate under the sunlight, and to actually change their old views, and to, if you wish, use the term moderate. It deprives them of that. If you drive anything, underground, you will find that the extremists within that particular party win the day, win the argument within the organization. And therefore I would say, actually, in free societies, the tenets and the sort of ideological, philosophical backbone of what constitutes the Muslim Brotherhood ideology, I think it would be a fantastic addition to the mosaic that makes up, the likes of British society or other Western societies.
So is that what's happening in Egypt?
What is happening in Egypt?
You said that if you drive a movement underground, the extremists will take control of it.
Well,
is that what's happening?
I don't know exactly what's happening. Maybe Ibrahim Munir will know better about what's happening, but I'm telling you...
I'm asking for your observation of what you've seen since the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood.
I am comforted. I'll tell you what.
Jailed and driven underground.
I am comforted by the constant stream of statements from the leadership who languish behind bars, hanging under death sentences, who constantly call for peaceful protests
but you just
and
said,
reject.
But you've just said the opposite.
No. What I'm saying is, when you drive any movement underground, you get the extremists to win the day, and that might well be, But yes, but what that means
you were quite explicit. The extremists win if you drive it underground, and you're now saying that the extremists.
But with the leader,
the leadership remains moderate.
Yes, and that will result in something which has happened time and time again, and that is that the people who want to defy the commands of the leadership will leave, and they will create their own entities. I mean, it's happened in the case of the IRA. It's happened in the case of various other liberation movements across the world. It's the very same thing. The leadership constantly emits statements saying that the only way that we will defy this is by peaceful protests. They couldn't have been more overt. The vast majority, as we can see, because there hasn't been an outpour or an explosion of violence, despite the immense crackdown on civil liberties throughout Egyptian society, we haven't seen. So it seems that the vast majority of the Muslim Brotherhood are still obeying and towing the line of the leadership. But the fact that if we constantly and continuously...
But that's the remarkable point, isn't it?
Which is what?
The conventional wisdom would be, which I would have shared. The point you made in terms, put them underground, the extremists will win. The rather remarkable circumstance in Egypt is that's not happened. There's a contest between the leadership and the youth.
Absolutely.
But that's far from over at this stage, and there's certainly no guarantee. Certainly, actually, the extremists don't appear to be winning.
Well,
so the statement you made that the extremists will win is
that's to the credit of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and I think that speaks a lot. And I really thank you for bringing this particular point out. It's to the credit of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt that despite the immense oppression that they fall under, the fact that the extremists till now, almost we're in our fourth year now, 4 years after the coup and the continuous escalation in violence against civil liberties, that the extremists still haven't found a platform within that particular. I'll tell you what will happen and what has happened time and time again. We mentioned earlier Sayyid Qutb. The people who interpreted the words of Sayyid Qutb wrongly, I would say, because the vast majority who read and understood.
I'm not too keen on getting into
but this is because this was in the review. The issue of Ayman al-Zawahiri and the fact that he read for Sayyid Qutb and the fact that then he became the second in command for Al-Qaeda. This actually proves the point of the Muslim Brotherhood defying and renouncing violence. Because had Sayyid Qutb actually invoked and called for violence, then Ayman al-Zawahiri would have led the Muslim Brotherhood down the route of violence. But he couldn't, so he had to leave and he had to create or help to create a different, separate, actually hostile entity to the Muslim Brotherhood called Al-Qaeda in order to carry out the interpretations which he thought that Sayyid Qutb had spoken of.
Okay, I still don't understand why you're not a Muslim brother after all that. Nadeem, last question.
My apologies. Sindus, why have you joined the Brotherhood?
It's a completely personal
Fair enough.
issue.
No, I know. That's.
So I'm an academic. After the Arab Spring, I have actually been publicly supportive of the Brotherhood.
I know.
Yeah.
I've got it. Really, last question to you, sir. Is the Brotherhood still just a Brotherhood? I hope there's a sisterhood. And if there is, how many female members do you have in Egypt, for example?
What's the question again?
How many female members does the Brotherhood
كم
have?
عدد أعضاء الأخوات؟ الأخوات عددهم كم؟ إخوان؟
يعني تقريبا حوالي يصل إلى 40 أو 42% من عدد الإخوان الموجودين.
They are about approximately 40 to 42% of the total membership.
Of the total, which is the 800, 900,000? 900,000.
Okay, if we can follow up with that on
So, could a woman lead the Freedom and Justice Party?
هل ممكن المرأة تقود حزب الحرية والعدالة؟
Can you Chika? If it's voted for her in Chika, it is a democracy.
And the same with Ennahda, presumably.
Absolutely, yeah. Female members are at every level of the leadership in Ennahda. So, and Tunisia is the only country that has parity in the elections for parliament, in the constitution. So we have about 30, or almost 40% of members of parliament are women.
So, Dr. Al-Tukriti, how long do you think it would be till you conceivably saw a woman leading either of these two parties?
In the case of Tunis, not long. In the case of Tunis, I actually know a few women whom are more than capable of leading in the next 5 to 10 years. So I don't think, and to be honest, I think that what pleases me in the case of Ennahda and studying it quite closely and knowing Sheikh Rashid al-Ghannouchi himself personally, what pleases me is the fact that this is almost a non-issue in terms of women are quite solidly placed within the hierarchy, and it's not even an issue. I know, for instance, in the case of, let me give you another example, in the case of Iraq, for instance, and the Muslim Brotherhood in Iraq, this is a deeply troubling issue. And in order to confront this issue, there needed to be a provision within the electoral rules in order to give a quota to women, in order to confront the fact that had it not been for the quota, that women might not get elected at all. So it's a real problem. In the case of Tunis, I see that as something which is highly comforting, I believe.
Thank you very much. And to you, Mr. Munif, does the Muslim Brotherhood seek unity of Muslims under a caliphate? And if that is the case, what's your understanding of a caliphate?
هل يجب وحدة المسلمين تحت مظلة الخلافة؟ وإذا كان الأمر كذلك ما هي يعني وجهة نظرك أو فكرتك عن الخلاف؟
يعني رؤية الإخوان المسلمين أكبر من هذا الموضوع أيضا. الإخوان المسلمين تسعى إلى وجود مجتمع عالمي بكل فئاته وكل تنوعاته مثل الأمم المتحدة، إنما ليس بالصورة الموجودة عليها الأمم المتحدة الآن. مجتمع عالمي يعني الإنسانية فيه هي الأساس، والحرص على ثروات الأرض وحرية الناس في الاختيار هي الأساس. ويعني هذه الصورة التي ترجوها كما يقال عند الإخوان المسلمين العالميين. إنما بالنسبة للسؤال الآخر
actually, the vision of Muslim Brothers is broader and wider than that. We look forward for an international community in which all the groups and all the components are represented in their diversity and variety, and is like the United Nations and not like what we have of the United Nations now. But the idea is like that all the nations will be there well represented, and the basis will be humanity. Humanity should be the basis for that, and the aim is two things: to preserve the wealth of this universe, the resources, and the complete freedom of the individuals. This is what we are dreaming of.
So this would be... sorry, go on. Yeah, you just finished.
بالنسبة للخلافة، الخلافة تعبير الخلافة ليس من الدين هذا التعبير يعني، إنما نسعى إلى مجتمع، نسعى إلى وحدة إسلامية مثل الاتحاد الأوروبي أو غيرها تحت أي مسمى، مع احتفاظ كل قطر من الأقطار أو كل بلد من البلدان ب يعني هويته الخاصة وعاداته الخاصة، إنما على الأقل في المستوى السياسي العالمي يبقى هناك تعاون على إعطاء الحرية الدينية والحرية البشرية للناس في إطار ما يتصوره الإسلام من عقائد وسلوكيات.
The word or the term Khilafah is not a religious expression. It's not existing in the religion as such. What we are hoping for, nevertheless, is to achieve Islamic unity. Take a parallel of that is the European unity, that the European countries
vote to leave.
But you are only minority.
It's a great opportunity.
The majority is staying.
Take charge while you've got it.
Now we're getting something.
Well, and but this unity will happen in such way that each country is preserving its own character and its own identity and its own habits.
يعني يشغل الإخوان المسلمين.
Can I just finish the last one? And at the political level, this will be the Islamic idea of globalism, that we all cooperate to achieve the prosperity and peace for everyone and to guarantee the freedom for everyone.
يعتقد الإخوان المسلمين أن الله خلق الأرض لصالح الناس بما فيها من ثروات ومعادن وإمكانيات يعني. فأي تعاون على هذا الحفاظ يعني هم يسعون إليه ويدعون إليه، ويتصورون أنه المجتمع الحر كما تصور السيد الرئيس أن المجتمع الحر ضروري، ووجود فكر الإخوان المسلمين فيه ضروري، إما أن يأخذ الناس من الفكر الإخوان المسلمين أو الإخوان المسلمين يأخذوا من أفكار الناس، وهي ده المجتمع الإنساني الذي يعمل الإخوان المسلمين على أنه يرتقي، يكون أيضا في مستوى العمل اللي خلق ربنا سبحانه وتعالى عليه، الإنسانية اللي ربنا خلق الناس عليها.
Muslim brothers believe that God created this earth for the benefit of humankind with all its resources and wealth. And any cooperation in that side, in that aspect or in that way, to preserve and promote this is welcomed. And I may quote this word of the chairman of the session. Yes, the free society or community is a necessity, because in such society we can expect a real interaction between different elements, and in such society Muslim brothers can offer and can take from the others, and everybody else is doing the same, giving and taking from the fellow citizens.
I want to just how free a society you all want. I'm going to ask you a yes-no question. If the answer is yes, it doesn't need more explanation. If it's no, I'll be grateful for it. Do you accept that in sexuality an individual is entitled to a private life which the law should not interfere with? Sandos?
Yes.
Dr. Mazmouni?
Yes.
Dr. Al-Takriti? Mr. Munir?
لكن بالنسبة لما يتعلق بالنشاط الطبيعة الجنسية sexuality.
هل
The sexuality and what else?
I'll let Dr. Al-Takriti answer the question.
هل للفرد في المجتمع الحق في اختيار يعني اختياراته من حيث الحياة الجنسية في حياته الخاصة؟
يعني الأمر الطبيعي في في المجتمع على الأرض الآن، كل مجتمع له مثله وكل مجتمع له خصوصياته. نقول إنه الإنسان حر، الله سبحانه وتعالى أعطاه الحرية في أن يفعل ما يشاء، لأن الله هو اللي هيحاسبه. إنما نقول مرة أخرى إنه أي مجتمع في إطار المجتمع الذي يعيش فيه، المجتمع الذي يحدد هذه كل سلوكيات الإنسان. إنما مرة أخرى أقول إنه الإنسان حر في اختيار ما يشاء في داخل إطار العرف العام الموجود في المجتمع.
So yes.
No, that definitely wasn't yes. I'd be grateful for a full translation.
Well, I mean, I say that each society has its own ideals and its own characteristics. In general, as I said, and I repeat here, man is indeed free in what he is doing, because it's only God who will settle the accounts with him. And when it comes to the level of the society, it so happened that the society also has got its own way, and it is for the members of the society to respect this way and these traditions or these norms. So that is في حاجة تانية.
So that's a no.
هل معنى ذلك إنه ليس الإنسان الخيار في الحرية الجنسية أو الخيار؟
حر فيما يشاء.
No, I said everyone is free to do what he wants.
إنما أقول هذا الموضوع.
But no, it's quite an important question here, because you said in the terms of within the norms of that society, and this is an issue on which the Brotherhood and Sharia and the teachings run straight head on into universal human freedoms. And I want to understand from Mr. Munir whether the Brotherhood and political Islamists have begun to get to terms, as society has here over the course of the last 50 years, with this fundamental human freedom. This is not a choice of people, this is how people are.
الآن أصبحت الحرية كهذا الشذوذ والأمثال اللي ذكرها حريات أساسية للإنسان، والمجتمع الدولي يلح على هذا عندما يتحدث مع الإخوان وغيرهم. فهل أنتم عندكم استعداد، أو هل أنتم توافقون على هذا، أو أنكم ترفضونه؟ إما لا أو نعم.
لا ونعم صعب، يعني yes or no very difficult to say no. انما اقول انه المساله ان تكون بشكل دولي هذا كلام غير واقعي. نحن الان هذا الامر حديث جديد على القوانين الانسانيه والسلوك الانساني ان يخرج بهذه الصوره. انما ما اقوله ان كل انسان حر اذا يختار المثليه الجنسيه وغيرها، انما ما دامت في حدود المجتمع تكون بينه وبين في داخل بيته في خارج، انما بهذه الصوره. انما اعتقد الان ان محاوله العولمه القيام بفرض هذا الامر، انا اتصور انه هذا الامر سيكون له سلبيات كبيره جدا. بهذا بالفرض القانوني ستكون له سلبيات كبيره جدا، حتى ليس في داخل المجتمع الاسلامي او بالنسبه للشريعه الاسلاميه فقط، انما اقول ايضا يعني لو فرضناها على مجتمع من المجتمعات سنجد يعني باب كبير، باب ضخم جدا للتكفير وللمقاومه، سيؤدي الى نوع من الفساد لا تستطيعه اي دوله من الدول. انما نقول الان المفروض ان هذا الامر يعالج على المستوى العالمي بكيفيه اخراجه. ايضا انا يعني هذا بقول، انما احنا جماعه الاخوان المسلمين ليست عندنا دراسه حول هذا الامر في النهايه، ولا استطيع ان اقول نعم او لا الا بعد ان نقدم هذه الدراسه وتبحث جماعه الاخوان المسلمين في هيئاتها الحقيقيه او في هيئاتها القانونيه، ثم نقدمها الى الناس.
I hope I can remember everything, but if I miss, I will ask you.
No, we'll take an audio
so
translation.
What is said is that this behavior of man or human being in general is a private thing, and if it's done privately or whatever, there is no one can interfere in that. But it is as you call it, human freedom, and it is now in recent. Yes, it is a recent thing. Till recently, this was not an issue or the issue. So, in order to be imposed, or we imagine that the whole or the world force it on one society or another, or one area or another, this is not understood. But it is something which may, with whatever positive things it has, may bring many negative things. Even in societies which already started adapting, because if to be forced as a law, it will definitely create reactions within the community or the society, any society or any community, and this can bring more evils than the goods it brings. So we also in the Muslim Brothers, we did not have, I have to be honest with you in that, we did not have a chance to have a real and thorough study of the issue. And this would not be possible in the full-fledged way until we are restored, and those who are in charge and lead are returned back, and then we can deal with such important things. And until we come to a conclusion to that, whatever I'm saying is premature and pre the time.
أنا هنا في المجتمع الوطني لا أعترض عليه، إنما أتصور إنه لابد أن توضع ليس كل العالم مثل الغرب في تصوراته وفي الأيديولوجية التي يعيش بها، إنما نتصور هذا الأمر لو فرض على أقطار معينة لا بعيدة، يعني أشخاص نحن نحافظ على حرية ناس ونحافظ على أمانهم الشخصي أيضا، فمثل هذه الأمور قد تعرض بعض الأشخاص لأنها مخالفة للعرف الجديد، عرف جديد مخالف للناس. أنا أتصور الخوف على من له هذا الخيار، الخوف على حريته ودمه، أعتقد لابد أن تؤخذ أيضا في الاعتبار في هذه الدراسة. ولذلك أنا أقول أن الدراسة يعني إذا تم عولمة من ناحية العولمة تحتاج إلى دراسة كثيرة لا أستطيع أن أقدمها الآن، ولا تستطيع جماعة الإخوان المسلمين فقط أن تقدمها، إنما تحتاج إلى مراكز عالمية تبحث أوضاع الناس في وضع الأقطار واتجاهات الناس لتخرج بطريقة فيها أمن للجميع.
Considering this issue as such or similar ones as part of global policy and globalization is a risky thing because it deals with communities, and individuals in different communities have different visions and different nature and different traditions and the rest. So something might be accepted in one society could not be accepted in the other. And therefore we are concerned not only with the freedom which we cherish and want for everyone to be free to do everything and to be, but we also care for the individual security, the person's security. And we are worried that if things are forced, that might bring risks against the people who champion or call for this from the rest of the society, which is not accepting the idea or not understanding it.
Well, this,
and if we want really to be honest with such issues, we need to give it enough time to be studied thoroughly and to be looked at wisely from all aspects before take decision. And unfortunately, we were not given this.
Well, let me just finish with an observation, because this issue stands also for atheists and for other minorities, about the freedoms they would enjoy in a society run by political Islamists. And in the time the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood now have in exile from forced exile from power, it might be an idea to have this debate and to reconcile some of these issues so that those parts of the world who hold strongly to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and basic human freedoms can get some comfort that those rights of these minorities would be protected. Anyway, that's the observation I'll leave you with. Now over to Mr. Barron.
I'd like, time is running short. First of all, can we say thank you, because I know, courtesy of Ramadan, this has already proving a long day. But thank you for this and sticking with us. Can I just, I want to just focus on one point, because time is short. In the democracies, the fragile democracies that emerged post the Arab Spring, I suppose you could say, and one of the key questions we want to try to get to the heart of is, are there undemocratic tendencies when it comes to Islamists, or is it that you just had a difficult hand to play in a region that there was, if you like, not a strong history of democracy to say the least, that you were dealing with institutions, undemocratic institutions, they hadn't been elected, that were deeply rooted and conservative in their nature against you? And I would just like your view very briefly on that, on how you now, looking back over that period of quite great transition, whether you felt that you were justified in the actions because the results were mixed and from one country to the other from your point of view. Well, you felt that looking back at developments post the Arab Spring, it was more of an issue from your point of view that you were dealing with an area which did not have a strong democratic tendency, that you were dealing, as I said, with institutions, deeply rooted institutions in some cases, the military, the judiciary, for example, that were undemocratic themselves in many cases. How do you now assess that period, which was, in many eyes, the first true litmus test of how Islamists would, how inclusive they would be, how they would deal with democracy post-Arab Spring? Can I start with, if I may, Ms. Assam?
I think this is a very important question, and I've explained that in my written submission, which I submitted. I think I focus on the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, who I think they were more democratic than all the other parties, whether the secular or the Salafi parties. In terms of the track record of Dr. Mohammed Morsi, who came to power after the Arab Spring, I think the biggest challenge that he faced was, as you mentioned, the undemocratic deep state, the military, the judiciary, and their allies in the different state institutions. And I think that the military coup in 2013 was actually a reaction to his attempt to democratize Egypt, to turn it into a civilian regime, and his resistance to the military's encroachment on the democratic process, their attempts to block his decisions, and there, I think that who we can characterize as undemocratic are either the military or those forces that have helped bring the military back to power in 2013. I think that's very, very briefly.
Okay, and as the others, as you all answer, can I just add one small question, because I'm conscious we've got colleagues who haven't spoken at all yet in this. Very quickly, what lessons, in addition to answering my original question, what lessons do you think you've learnt going forward? Dr. Masmoudi.
About your first question, I would say that Nahda Party certainly has passed the test in Tunisia as an Islamic party that believes in democracy. It did everything humanly possible and made the most concessions throughout the last 5 years to make sure that democracy succeeds in Tunisia. So I think in Tunisia, the Islamists or the Islamic Party, I think, were the champions really of democracy and of the successful transition to democracy so far. And they really believe that democracy is important and is the key to progress and to security. And so the goal is not only to prove that democracy is possible in the Arab world, which I think we have proved that. Now the challenge is to prove that democracy delivers a better life. We have not yet proved that. That is still a challenge in Tunisia. And so we are concerned that the transition in Tunisia is in danger, not because democracy is not possible, but because democracy has not yet delivered a better life to its citizens. And by that I mean the economic situation in Tunisia. So if I have any comments about that, is we need help from the West, from the UK, from the US. Tunisia needs time, and all democratic transitions take time, but the economic situation is in dire need. Tourism is a big sector of the Tunisian industry. Investment is a big sector of the Tunisian industry, and both of them have basically stopped. The economic situation is bad. The lesson that we learned in Tunisia is the importance of consensus. We cannot move forward in a transition without consensus. So all the parties have to come together, and they have to find the compromises, and they have to find the middle ground on which they can all agree. After you build democracy, you can govern with 51%. But when you are still in the process of building democracy, of the transition to democracy, you cannot govern with 51%. You need consensus and you need dialogue. And this is what really is the important lesson, especially on the constitution. The way Tunisia wrote the constitution should be a lesson for all countries around the world, how we wrote the constitution. It has not really been explained very well. But 2 years of negotiations, 2 years of meetings and dialogue to come to a consensus so that at the end, 94% of the members of the Constituent Assembly voted for the Constitution. So it was really by consensus. It was unifying all Tunisians.
Just some quick points. The Arab Spring wasn't done on the say-so of any particular section of Arab societies, whether in Tunisia, whether in Egypt or elsewhere. I think that up until Egypt, I think that the Arab Spring, and the term I insist on, and I promote quite widely, I think it's achieved two very important things. The first is that it asserted the notion of transformative nonviolence, of peaceful, civil mass movements that can actually change the realities. And that was incredibly important in a region which, as we all know, is abundant with violence and weapons and conflicts and wars and divisions and the such. The second is quite important, particularly after Iraq in 2003, and that is that societies can actually change and remove their dictators without calling on the direct military intervention of the West. They can do it themselves. And I think those two important facts were quite well translated, particularly in the case of Tunisia, which had, fortunately for all of us, which had the space and had the time, and it had also the wisdom, the maturity in order to get Tunis to where we are today. In the case of Egypt, I think is quite important, simply because it's not, and I do understand the question, I do understand that we're having a discussion about political Islam and about the Muslim Brotherhood particularly. But in all honesty, if I was to comment on this from a neutral point of view, I'd say that it's not the political Islam that should be held to account here, and their democratic credentials searched and scrutinized. It's actually ourselves here in Britain, the West generally, which has been calling on this region, this dark region for over a century, to democratize, to reform, to engage, and to open up and the such. And when they did, at the slightest hint of revolt from the Arab Spring, the anti-democratic movement, we just basically watched by as democracy was crushed. I think we have a lot to answer for, far more than political Islam or the such. But your question is absolutely valid. What are the lessons to be learned? I think we can all speak wisely in hindsight, but the fact of the matter is, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt could have said, you know what, things are a total mess. We're just going to stand on the sidelines and just watch as factions burn each other down in the very first phase of this transformative era. And then we'll come and capitalize on what remains when things sort of settle down. But they didn't. They got engaged in the very first step. Now, some might criticize them and say, well, you shouldn't have. But I think that they showed extreme courage in taking ownership of that particular era. And let's not forget, they were democratically elected. They were democratically elected. And, all their policies afterwards in terms of involving and engaging those who actually voted against them, I think showed that their democratic credentials are, to be honest, are beyond question. And I absolutely agree with the chairman in terms of his observation that now there is this time that people can sit on the sidelines or maybe languish in prisons and think about how they would do things differently. I think maybe develop and evolve philosophies and internal theories and the such. That's absolutely valid. But the question, once again, I come back, and as a British citizen I speak here, I come back to how we behaved in the time of a democracy being crushed at the behest of it.
6 o'clock, I go to Mike Gates now.
Right, thank you. I could ask a lot of questions. I'm not going to. I'll just make 2 comments. The Copts in Egypt, Boutros Ghali was foreign minister. He was a Copt. So they certainly had a role under the previous governments. And did they not have churches burnt down under the Morsi administration? And those churches have been let me finish. And rebuilt by the Sisi government. So Mr. Munir said that Sayyid Qutb did not preach violence. And you, Mr. Al-Zakriti, in your paper to us, you kind of brushed aside and said, well, he may have said it, but it didn't really mean what he said because it didn't happen at the time. It happened later, and it was other people. Isn't the Takfiri ideology, the labelling of people as apostates, the statements made against the Jews by Qutb in his book Our Struggle with the Jews, or the book Milestones, the statements about a war against Jews, and subsequent statements, Mr. Al-Qaradawi, who you also mentioned, isn't that an indication that there is within your ideology a hatred or a violence towards other communities? And isn't it time you revised these things and disowned the origins of this, of Sayyid Qutb and Hassan al-Banna?
Questions to me?
Yeah, well,
first of all,
or Mr. Munir as well.
يعني للأسف الشديد أنا أقول إنه التاريخ يقرأ بطريقة غير صحيحة. ليس هناك أصلا في الإسلام ولا عند الإخوان المسلمين عداء بين اليهود الديانة اليهودية أو المسيحيين، إنما حتى في مصر الآن عندما حسن البنا في أول نشأة التنظيم أنشأ لجنة سياسية، لأنه كان يعتبر أن المسيحيين جزء من الوطن، ولا السياسة بالنسبة لجماعة الإخوان المسلمين تشمل الوطن. اختار 3 أو عين 3 من المسيحيين ليكونوا موجودين في هذه اللجنة لتوجيه سياسة جماعة الإخوان المسلمين.
Unfortunately, history is still read in incorrect method or way, because if you go to Islam or if you go to the literature of Ikhwan and their principles, there is no such thing like animosity or hatred to Judaism or Jews. And Hassan al-Banna, for instance, the founder of Muslim Brothers, from the early formative periods, formed or constituted a political committee in order to help him making the policies and leading the group. And in this committee, he appointed 3 non-Muslim members because he knows that these are part and parcel of the society. So their word has to be heard and they have to be active in such things.
هناك نص في القرآن يتكلم على ليس اليهود ولا النصارى، إنما على أي إنسان معارض في نص وإن جنحوا للسلم فاجنح له. إن نحن لا نسعى إلى حرب ولا نسعى إلى عداء. أقول إنه أيضا ما يقوله الشيخ القرضاوي، أحد أكبر علماء الأمة الإسلامية السنة الآن، أو يقول غيره، نحن الآن بيننا وبينه الصحيح ما فيما نتصوره. ثم أقول مرة أخرى، أي إنسان يقول خاص خارج موضوع الشريعة وسياسة نتناقش معه فيه، ولنا مبادئ ولنا صور لا نخرج عنها. ويبقى أيضا أقول إن مشكلة أنظمتنا أنها تعالج الفكر بالقمع بالضرب وبالقتل، وهو ما ينشئ أجيال جديدة متشددة أكثر من الأجيال التي سبقتها. هذا هو الأسلوب الذي أنظمة في بلادنا تعاملت به مع الفكر المتشدد. إذا قال إنما أنا لا أتصور أن الشيخ القرضاوي كانت له بعض الفتاوى، صحيح هذه الفتاوى، إنما هذه لا تلزم أحد غيره. وإذا كانت له فتاوى مخالفة لمنهاج الجماعات الإخوان المسلمين نقول إن هذا يخصه أيضا مع كامل الاحترام للشيخ القرضاوي. الشيخ القرضاوي نفسه أعلن أنه ليس من الإخوان المسلمين، فلا نحمل أي جهة أخرى أو أي الإخوان المسلمين أو غيرها حديث للشيخ القرضاوي أو لغير الشيخ القرضاوي. أنا أقول هذا الكلام لأن أرجو أنه الإعلام أحيانا هو الذي يعطي صورا غير حقيقية. أيضا التقارير التي تأتي من الأنظمة يعني أتصور أنه من العدل والعدالة أن ينظر فيها بنظرة قضائية وليست أن تكون كلها مسلم بها. الأنظمة التي تتبعها بلادنا.
One statement in the Quran can explain everything. There is a verse which says that if they, and here they is referring not to only to the Jews or Christians, but to believers of any religion, if they tend towards peace, you should be peaceful to them. That means what? You should not start any hatred or animosity. And if people are peaceful, you have no justification to have any animosity against them. The problem is that unfortunately our regimes is facing the ideas and thoughts with suppression and oppression. And hence they produce generations of militant or violent people. And when we talk about Sheikh Qaradawi, we acknowledge that he is one of the great scholars of Islam in our time. but in Islam, the fatwa issued by a scholar is not obligatory on the others. It is his own view of the thing. So he should be responsible for it, and we have the right as Muslims to argue and to debate these rules and these findings of any scholar according to the regulations of Islam. And add to that, despite we have great respect to him, he himself declared that he's not of Muslim Brothers. So I don't understand why should the Muslim Brothers be held accountable to him if he himself denies that he is a member of the Muslim Brothers. One last thing, that unfortunately most of the reports coming from the ruling regimes, should be taken with great caution, because many of them are not.
A couple of very important issues. Now, my colleague, Mr. Kaczynski, has been unbelievably patient, so I'm going to give the last couple of questions to him.
Sure.
And if the answers could be crisp, please, as far as possible.
Well, yes. Could I ask this question, please, to Ms. Assam? Why did the FJP in Egypt fail to work with its largest opponents like Noor and Fakh parties, while Ennahda in Tunisia did form a coalition with its largest opponent, Nida Tunis?
Did you say the Noor party?
Sorry?
Which parties?
Noor and Wafd.
Noor and Wafd.
Yeah. Okay. I think the FJP did actually immediately after the revolution, before the establishment of the Freedom and Justice Party, Dr. Mohammed Morsi and Dr. Mohammed Badi', who were then the most senior leaders in the Brotherhood. They met with the military just like all the other parties, and they actually proposed that they would run in elections as part of a cross-ideological coalition that composed initially of 40 parties, and these parties included the Al-Wafd party and included many other parties. And when they did run in elections, the coalition which the FJP was part of was the only cross-ideological coalition that was neither strictly secular nor strictly Islamist. On the other hand, the other coalitions that ran in elections were either the strictly Salafist coalitions or the strictly secular coalitions. So I think they did attempt to have an inclusive representation in parliament. The Wafd party is the one which actually left the Democratic Alliance by the time of the elections. It initially joined the FJP as part of one coalition, and then it left the Democratic Alliance. It preferred to run independently, and that was their own choice, just like a number of other parties did. I think, so in answer of your question, I actually think that they did have an alliance, and they actually ran in elections as part of an alliance. Have I answered your question?
Well, you say an alliance, they ran as an alliance, but they didn't actually form a government as such, did they, together at any stage?
In fact, concerning the governments, when President Morsi had the authority to have a government, his choice for prime minister was not from the Muslim Brotherhood. The majority of the government were not from the FJP. In fact, the largest representation in any government after Dr. Morsi got elected, the largest representation either from the Brotherhood or from the FJP were 9 out of 36 ministers. That was the largest representation, which is approximately 25% of the cabinet. So I think that in fact most of the governments the majority of the governments under Dr. Morsi were from non-FJP politicians, whether from leftist parties, whether liberal parties or independent technocrats.
Okay.
These are historical facts, and I've mentioned that in my written submission as well.
Right, okay, thank you. I think we've only got a minute left, so this question is from Mr. Masmoudi. Tunisia has been one of the largest sources of foreign fighters joining Islamic extremists fighting abroad particularly in Libya and Syria. Could you have done more to clamp down on extremists after the revolution? And I don't think you're going to get the chance to answer that.
I'll give you a minute.
A minute,
Then
okay.
we're going to have to finish.
In general, yes, I think we could have done more to clamp down, but you have to remember after the revolution, the first year, there was a very weak security system in Tunisia after the collapse, basically, of the old regime, and the Salafists took over many mosques, literally by force. The government then came back when Ennahda came to power in 2012 and took back most of those mosques. But the root cause of the fact that many Tunisians have gone to these extremist groups is actually the Ben Ali era, 23 years before the revolution. There is no religious education at all in Tunisia. So young people are
I'm going to have to
don't know religion.
I'm sorry, because otherwise we won't make the division. That doesn't give me time to thank you all for your evidence. I'm extremely grateful. There are some issues, particularly around attitudes to violence and the use of the justification for violence that I do want to explore. We haven't had time to get into, and I want to write to Dr. Al-Takriti and to Mr. Munir, if I may, with some follow-up questions on those issues. But I'm, on behalf of the committee, extremely grateful for your evidence. Thank you very much indeed. Order. Sitting meetings now adjourned.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.